The No BS Spiritual Book Club, the only no BS guide to the best spiritual books to inspire your own journey of self-discovery. Here's your host, founder of the No BS Spiritual Book Club, Sandie Sedgbeer.
Hello. Dr. Eben Alexander was a man of science, a neurosurgeon, researcher, and a Harvard professor who spent decades studying the brain and trusting biology to explain consciousness. Then, in 2008, a rare bacterial infection shut down his brain for 7 days. During that time, he experienced a reality that defied every medical model he'd ever taught, a realm beyond space, time, and the physical body. His return not only shattered his former beliefs, but also ignited a global conversation about the true nature of mind, soul, and the afterlife. Eben Alexander joins me today to share the 10 books that most profoundly shaped his life journey, both before and after that transformative near-death experience. Dr. Eben Alexander, welcome.
Sandie, it's great to be with you today. Thanks so much for having me on.
And such an interesting list it is too. Now, you've said before that your list reflects your life both before and after your near-death experience. So were you already exploring ideas about consciousness before 2008?
Well, I would say I was very interested, like most neuroscientists, and certainly as a neurosurgeon. I was fascinated by consciousness and how the brain and mind are connected. And I can tell you that the scientific world, certainly, looking back on my training and then early career in the 90s and early 2000s, we really had no idea where even to begin about further defining that relationship. But I would say, and we'll get into this when we talk about the books that I like, that there have been some inflection points where we've been able to kind of refocus our understanding and actually made some progress. And I would say we're a lot further along that pathway of understanding than we were 30 years ago.
And your experience must have contributed to that understanding for your colleagues. But when you first had the experience, what was their response?
Well, the interesting thing is that the doctors at the hospital where I worked and where I was hospitalized knew something big had happened. This story was really out there. And that's something that many people out in the world probably don't know, is how impressed the local medical community was with my situation. The fact that I had this horrific case of bacterial meningitis, was expected towards the end of a week in coma, have only a 2% chance of survival, no chance of recovery, to then come back to this world, even with a wrecked brain, but then over 2 months to have everything come back, including a very complete restitution of memories, etc., was a deep mystery. Initially, they asked me to come to my own morbidity mortality conference. That's where we discussed the really challenging cases that usually result in death or complete destruction of somebody's life. And yet I had come all the way through it. And that's what the doctors wanted to hear about. And then the County Medical Society asked me to give a talk at the local country club, and about 120 doctors from our community came. So in other words, the scientific community locally knew something big and dramatic and surprising had happened. And that's a piece that's lost to the rest of the world. But then I found out that there are scientists around the world who've been studying this for a long time, and that in many ways my case proved to be instrumental in helping them make the case that consciousness is not created by the brain. The brain is a filter or a transceiver that allows access to a primordial unified consciousness, but it's not the ultimate creator of consciousness. And that's why all these stories of near-death experiences, deathbed visions, after-death communications, etc., now have come alive in this new scientific paradigm, because they really happen and they really have explanations that are very profound about the nature of the soul, the spiritual nature of our universe, and the nature of reality. And so in many ways, the scientific community has embraced me and my story. And likewise, I've embraced the scientific community who have studied consciousness and not defaulted to the simplistic materialist assumptions that none of this can be real because it doesn't fit the conventional Newtonian deterministic paradigm.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, talking about reality, let's have a look at your first book, 1001: A Space Odyssey. Arthur C. Clarke, published in 1968. I bet he would have liked to have been around to hear your story.
I think he would have loved hearing my story, but he contributed tremendously. That book. And, the movie's okay. It's a little slow paced by today's standards, but the ending of that movie is nowhere near as powerful as the ending of the book. And that was one thing I loved about the book. It turns out I also read it when I was a teenager and I had a paper route. And it just so happens that I would, the week that I read that book, I would get up at about 2 a.m. I had to go out and deliver papers at 4. But I get up at 2 and I'd read 2001: A Space Odyssey. I'd read it a little bit more and a little bit more each day. Then I'd go out under the stars delivering papers. I would look up with these fantastic thoughts about what Arthur C. Clarke was pointing out about the true existence of advanced civilizations far beyond our technological capabilities that could basically guide civilizations in certain directions, which is exactly what 2001 is all about. But to me, it was a fascinating kind of journey into extremely advanced civilizations far beyond our wildest imagination, coexisting with us in the universe. And to me, that was just a magical environment. I highly recommend that book to anybody who wants a really mind-bending book. I mean, even, here we are 60 or so years later, that book still has some tremendous power to it.
It does. Do you think that reading that book at that time, so young, that it kind of planted a seed that made you kind of open later on to matters beyond the material world?
Well, I would say it definitely opened my mind to recognize that the greatest kind of indicator of any wisdom you might have is acknowledging the limits of your knowledge and how little you know about the nature of reality. When we start seducing ourselves into thinking we're close to a theory of everything, that's when we've really lost it. But that's what that book awakened in me, was this tremendous sense of the possibilities out there in the universe beyond my wildest dream.
Mm-hmm. Well, book number 2 is The Emperor's New Mind, Concerning Computers' Minds and the Laws of Physics by Roger Penrose, published in 1989.
Well, I think that book opened a lot of people's minds, certainly to the fact that if you want to pretend that the brain creates mind, you're facing a very uphill battle where the evidence is strongly against you. And that's why, right there in the title, Emperor's New Mind, like the Emperor's new clothes. The Emperor was running around naked. That was his new clothes. Well, guess what? The new mind is showing us that mind is not simply derivative from brain in the physical universe. Mind is something much more than that. And in fact, Penrose, who's a brilliant mathematician and cosmologist, goes on to make those points very elegantly in that book, The Emperor's New Mind, and especially that there are things that minds do that a digital computer could never do, even in principle. And that's a very important step. A lot of this discussion of brain and mind, we talk about the brain as being just a filter or transceiver that allows reception of this primordial mind and its message and its thoughts and its kind of existence. And this whole analogy, back in the late 1800s, they called the brain a reducing valve because the big technology of the day was the steam engine. So that's what they were analogizing there. Now, these days, we talk about the brain as a computer, but I can tell you that the brain is no more a steam engine than it is a computer in the digital computing sense. There's something far grander about mind and what it does. And the brain allows us to access mind, but mind itself is far beyond anything in this physical universe. And mind is also all interconnected. But Penrose made some excellent points in that book to discourage anyone from trying to pretend that the brain is simply a computer that generates mind. That is simplistic and false compared to what's really going on. And the bigger truth is all about primacy of consciousness and interconnectedness of mind, and the fact that when a brain and body die, that does not mean that your awareness of existence dies. In fact, it's expanded tremendously. And I would say The Emperor's New Mind was the first kind of hint that that might be the case.
Yeah. The third book is The Holographic Universe, The Revolutionary Theory of Reality, Michael Talbot, published in 1991.
Well, that's an absolutely beautiful book where he talks about the hologram. You know, the whole notion of a hologram is that parts of it can all contain the whole and vice versa. So it's kind of like this notion of the mind and the individual mind and then the universal mind. And in fact, in his book, Talbot does an excellent case of kind of presenting the mind as a holographic entity. It's not something that you can kind of split up like a physical object that where you're missing the wholeness in each of the parts and vice versa. It kind of reminds me of that Rumi poem. You're not a drop in the ocean, but you're the ocean in a drop. And that's exactly where these kind of modern ideas like we promote in our books, having to do with the primacy of mind and how the brain is just basically a tool for dissociation to bring you a little eddy current of that primordial mind. But when you die, that eddy current is reliberated back into the ocean, but in a fashion that preserves kind of the soul and a soul line of learning. And in Talbot's book, he starts by making this great case, reporting on Carl Pribram, who was a neuroscientist working at that time in the early 90s. Also the work of David Bohm in particular, his interpretation of the measurement paradox in quantum physics. David Bohm, I think, was a brilliant investigator with a lot of fantastic ideas. But anyway, Talbot takes those pieces of information and starts talking about the mind as a holographic device. That is, the mind has holographic principles, the whole reflecting the parts and vice versa. And then he goes into a big discussion of David Bohm and Bohmian mechanics and quantum physics and starts talking about the entire universe as having holographic principles. And then the way I interpret the book, at least, is he kind of then begins to overlap those two holographic entities of the mind and the universe at large, and you realize they're one and the same. It's just an astonishing book. In fact, I was so blown away when I read it. I said, oh my gosh, I got to read everything by this guy. What else has he written? Because it was published, I think, in 1991. And then I found out that he had passed from this world a year later. And that's why I think he knew he had an illness that was going to potentially take his life. And he was writing about these kind of bigger topics. And for him, it was kind of a very kind of optimistic prospect that this much bigger vision of mind could allow for someone to consider that their phenomenal awareness would exist beyond the death of the brain and body.
Book number 4 is The Conscious Mind, In Search of a Fundamental Theory by David Chalmers, published in 1996.
Well, that one is a real landmark book because that was David Chalmers is an Australian philosopher, and he very brilliantly pointed out some huge gaps in explanation of mental processes coming from physical brain processes. And it begins with the easy problems of consciousness, which is really the neural correlates that would associate with various qualia. Qualia are our mental states, like the redness of an apple would be a qualia. The feeling of falling in love would be a qualia. The disappointment in losing a loved one, or the sadness around losing a loved one, that's qualia. The kind of emotional feelings and kind of human, experiences that are correlated, presumably at that time, with neural networks and neural function. Now, we now know that you cannot fully explain mind based on brain, but back then they thought they could. And David Chalmers pointed out, no, there are these easy problems of consciousness, which many people thought would take about 100 years to unravel. I hope that tells you where the hard problem of consciousness lies, because the hard problem had to do with why there's any kind of phenomenal subjective experience at all. And what does it arise from? And Chalmers makes the argument so eloquently from a philosophical standpoint that he makes it crystal clear that materialism is not even remotely close. Our notions of brain creates consciousness and notions of neuroscience with the brain totally determining what happens in mind. He pointed out how hopeless those thoughts are. And I would say now the hard problem of consciousness, which is what he defined in that book, is simply an impossible problem for materialism, but it's a beautiful kind of invitation because it opens us up to post-materialist thinking about how to explain all this. And that's really where the science is headed on this, because from a modern scientific viewpoint, materialism is dead. I mean, the very awarding of the Nobel Prize in Physics for entanglement, quantum entanglement, in 2022, in many ways was a death knell of our old style four-dimensional space-time materialism and what Einstein referred to as local realism. Local meaning that all physics is particles touching each other, and none of those particles can travel faster than the speed of light. But then with entanglement, there seems to be instantaneous communication of information across the universe. And even though humans are not wise enough to be able to use entanglement for faster than light signal transfer at this time, the universe does it all the time. So we need to, mature and understand much better than our very primitive current kind of modulation of this. But entanglement was basically a demonstration that the mental field, which is what entanglement really is this mental field across space and time that gives us access to far grander information than we'd ever have through materialist techniques alone. But it opens us up to that far grander possibility. And that's exactly where that book hits home.
Well, book number 5 is Margins of Reality. I love the way this list goes. You've almost got a whole playlist here. You want to know about the brain? You want to know about consciousness? Here's the playlist. Yeah, Margins of Reality, the role of consciousness in the physical world, Robert Jarman.
That's an incredibly powerful book. It was actually written, I think, in 1987, published in 87. And it's by Robert John, Jahn, and Brenda Dunn, Dunne. And they worked at the Princeton Engineering Anomalies Research Lab, what's known as the PAIR Lab. And basically, they just documented over and over again these incredible examples of basically mind over matter, especially when it comes to microelectronics and quantum effects. It turns out that mind can have a tremendous influence on kind of shaping the emergence of our physical reality. And so Margins of Reality is all about the role of consciousness in governing events in the physical world. And an incredibly important work, but at a very controversial time. I mean, there were a lot of hardcore reactions from materialists who couldn't stand all this incredible information showing that their model of the universe was wrong and that there was something very fundamental about the existence of consciousness. So there were a lot of materialist scientists who fought like hell to suppress that book. And yet it was written by brilliant investigators who were very established engineers, and scientists. And they just really make the point that if you follow the evidence as opposed to following the limitations of theoretical models, which is where the materialists were going, but stick with the evidence, you start to uncover some fascinating truths about reality. And it's by that kind of approach that science over the last few decades has truly made some real progress in demonstrating this notion of primacy of mind and the brain as a filter, and that ultimately we're all interconnected through that kind of mental space. So Margins of Reality is an incredibly important book that shows the frail nonsense of materialism and why it doesn't fit reality, and we need to move beyond those simplistic and false models.
Yes, about time. Book number 6, another one by Roger Penrose, The Large, the Small, and the Human Mind, published in 1997.
Yeah, this one is a real gem. And it turns out that this was all about the Tanner lectures, 3 what are called Tanner lectures that Penrose gave at Cambridge University. And these were lectures on the intersection of the large, the whole universe, the cosmos, the small, that is the subatomic or quantum world, and they intersect right here at the human level. We're kind of in the middle. And so Penrose was making some incredibly important observations in this book about the mind and how people thought it worked at the time when this was written. Certainly, he was kind of rattling the cage in many ways. He'd come a long way from his position in Emperor's New Mind, but developed it much more prominently. But from my perspective, one of the best parts about the book are the 3 commentaries that are there to, Penrose puts forward his 3 Tanner lectures and his notions about mind and its kind of primacy and what quantum physics was showing us about mind. But then he has Nancy Cartwright, Abner Shimoni, and Stephen Hawking to make commentaries. Now, I'll tell you, I respect Stephen Hawking a lot. He's a brilliant cosmologist. He's passed a few years ago, but did some really amazing work. But on the other hand, he kind of was a staunch materialist, and he kind of drew the line there, and he had trouble going any further. And I'll tell you that of the 3 commentators of this work, and also Penrose, who I put in this category, that the least intelligent of them was Stephen Hawking. Now, that's not to put anything down about Stephen, but certainly to elevate Abner Shimoni, Nancy Cartwright, and Roger Penrose, because they are brilliant scientific and philosophical minds. And it really, a lot of it hinges on Gödel's incompleteness theorems, demonstration of the non-computability of mental processes. And in fact, in that particular book, he's kind of laying the groundwork for the interpretation of quantum physics. I mean, it's an interpretation of the measurement paradox in quantum physics that's the deep mystery. And there are at least 16 current versions of an interpretation of that paradox that has to do with the mind of the investigating scientist coming up with experiments to investigate quantum phenomena. And it turns out Stuart Hameroff, who's a colleague of ours who we've presented with, he's an anesthesiologist from Arizona. And he was the one who contacted Penrose after Emperor's New Mind came out and discussed with him that the microtubules in the neurons of the brain could serve as quantum computers by preserving quantum states long enough to contribute to mental processes. And by that, I mean processes that would be preserved for many, many microseconds. Because generally physicists were saying, no, quantum decoherence occurs so rapidly that you can't preserve the information. Hameroff got together with Penrose and said, yes, you can. Within microtubules, the environment is there. And they came up with what they call the orchestrated OR, orchestrated objective reduction, because they were viewing objective reduction of the wave function. And now with Penrose, they were using, I won't go into all the details, but basically using gravity. And quantum gravity is something that's not yet figured out by science. And yet Penrose was conjecturing that gravity would have to do with collapse of the wave function in that environment. Anyway, I think a lot of their points are good, but they also are not looking at kind of the spiritual mind over matter, spirit over matter kind of power that we've come to realize is real. I would say it's not this one graviton limit that Penrose was talking about in their orchestrated OR model, but something is much more involved with top-down causality that would allow for this mind over matter. That's where I think we're really headed with this. But that particular book, Large and Small in the Human Mind, is an incredibly erudite discussion of the various issues that can lead to this kind of understanding.
All of these books you rate exceedingly highly. The next one you say is probably one of the most important that you've ever read, and it's Larry Doss's One Mind. How our individual mind is part of a greater consciousness and why it matters, published in 2013.
Well, it turns out that Larry Dossey is an identical twin. And in fact, as I recall, he and his twin married identical twins. And they recognized, as many people who know twins do, that telepathy is a common thing that happens with twins. Now, telepathy happens in many other circumstances, but it's according to Guillaume Playfair in his book, Twin Telepathy, he says that 35% of identical twins have powerful telepathic experiences. And so Dossey knew that from personal experience, and he went off and running with it. He was is a brilliant physician. He's written incredibly good books about many topics, prayer, the mind, consciousness, etc. One Mind is really, I think, the pinnacle. In this book, he makes an excellent case that what we're really doing is sharing one mind among all sentient life, not just humans. And he has many examples in there of animals with, showing minds working together, like in the murmuration patterns of birds, insects working together, things like that, but also plenty of examples of humans and their kind of mind-to-mind interconnection. And the subtitle is How Our Individual Mind is Part of a Greater Consciousness. That is, as we'll point out in our book, we'll get to in a while, Living in a Mindful Universe. But there we're also pointing out this oneness of mind. The brain is a filter, that we're all truly in this together, and that some of the deepest experiences, like near-death experiences, point out this binding force of love as being absolutely critical. But the why it matters, I think, is where Larry really shines in that book, showing you how important it is to realize that, for example, to hurt another is to hurt yourself. That's what this one mind is all about. We're bound together through those forces of love. Even though he might use some spiritual terms, it's mainly a scientific book that makes an excellent case for the primacy of mind in the universe and how we're all part of that mind. It's a cause for great optimism, in human activities.
Yeah. Number 8, Mindful Universe, Quantum Mechanics and the Participating Observer, Henry Stapp.
Yes, well, Henry Stapp is one of my favorites. Turns out that there are several quantum physicists who have commented on quantum physics and consciousness. Now, you have some quantum physicists who don't know enough about consciousness, so they make no comment about that. But then you have this group of bright physicists. I would say you could start that list with Roger Penrose, a Nobel Prize winner in physics, and the books we've already discussed by him. He obviously has a big interest in consciousness, mind, and the brain, and the physics of it all. And then you have people like Brian Josephson, another Nobel Prize laureate. He's also written extensively on the connection between quantum physics and what it's telling us about mind and mental process. You've got Amit Goswami. He's also written about this as a quantum physicist.
Mm-hmm.
And I would simply add that Henry Stapp is, I think, right at the top of the list because he's a very respected quantum physicist from kind of the classical period, and yet he's written extensively about these very advanced ways of looking at brain function and mental function and how all that's interconnected. And his point, very much as we make in our book, is that the universe has a mind. That's why he calls it Mindful Universe. And our book is called Living in a Mindful Universe. But it has to do with the fact that, if you remember Heisenberg's uncertainty principle, that has everything to do with tight confinement of ions and neurotransmitters in synaptic vesicles. So these are all, physical entities that work in the quantum realm. And yet no neuroscientist would deny that any kind of mental function and brain function isn't entirely dependent at a root level on these atomic and subatomic particles, totally bound by quantum mechanics and quantum principles that are the engine of this brain thing we have. Now, again, the brain is not the cause of consciousness, but this bigger discussion allows us to realize how that tight confinement, Heisenberg's uncertainty principle tells us the more we know the location of a particle, the less we know its momentum. And it's that tight confinement of these ions and neurotransmitters that allows their quantum function to come to the fore. And a lot of that has to do with top-down causality. The assumption in materialist science is if you understand all the little particles, the electrons, the protons, quarks, neutrons, photons, etc., how they interact, the laws that govern them, then you can build that up and determine everything that's going to happen in the world. But it doesn't work like a Newtonian deterministic system. Quantum indeterminacy is still rampant, and quantum indeterminacy is right at the heart of our very free will. And I would say that Henry Stapp does an excellent job of painting that picture to give us this kind of functioning of these quantum elements in the brain and how they allow for this much grander appreciation of mind of the universe and how we basically harvest access to that mind through the workings of the brain. But I would say that Stapp rises above much of the noise of other quantum physicists who have tried to connect these dots in a way that to me made a tremendous amount of sense.
Book number 9, Consciousness Unbound, Liberating Mind from the Tyranny of Materialism. We've been heading this way all along. Edward Kelly, published in 2021, I think.
Yes,
Not so
absolutely.
long ago. Yeah.
And what a landmark work that is. Anybody who doesn't know about the work of the University of Virginia Division of Perceptual Studies, this is a big key. uvadops.org is an incredible resource. Ed Kelly is just one of the superstars there. You've got Bruce Grayson, who has studied near-death experiences from that institution for more than 45 years. You've got Jim Tucker, who took over the work of Ian Stevenson, studying now more than 2,500 cases of past life memories in children suggestive of reincarnation. And of those 2,500, about 1,700 cases have been solved. That is 1,700 times they've actually found the person who lived before. So it's not imagination. It's not wishful thinking. I mean, these memories are telling us something about the nature of soul, the spiritual nature of the universe. Ed Kelly is really kind of the grand master. He's the one who puts it all together. And he's written 3 big books in that trilogy. Consciousness Unbound is the third book. The first 2 books also recommended, but if you want to cut to the chase, let's go to Consciousness Unbound. The first 2 books, Irreducible Mind in 2008, really shook the world. 800 pages of dense data on the reality of non-local consciousness independent of the brain. Then the second book in 2015, Beyond Physicalism, also incredibly good. But then we finally get to Consciousness Unbound, liberating mind from the tyranny of materialism. And wow, does it ever do that? An extremely erudite, well-written scientific book. He's the editor, so he's invited many contributors to put in their pieces of expertise, but makes a clear case for evolutionary panentheism. The notion that God force, of the kind of ultimate mind we're talking about, is distributed all through sentient life throughout the universe, and that's what then experiences this physical universe. But it's all a way of completely flipping the script and realizing that mind is foremost and central, that God mind being the origin of it all. And I would say that Ed Kelly's brilliant books, and especially Consciousness Unbound, are right there for anybody with a serious scientific interest in the nature of reality and the relationship of brain and mind. And if you only had one book to read to summarize it all and bring it all together, probably Consciousness Unbound would do it.
Yeah, you said
But
it's
it's also a deep work, so be prepared.
Yeah. So book number 10, Spiritual Science, Why Science Needs Spirituality to Make Sense of the World by Steve Taylor, 2018. Steve was on this show just a few months ago. Really like his work.
Steve's a brilliant mind. I love his work. I'll put out there that there's something called the BigelowInstitute.org, and people will find 29 essays supporting the reality of primacy of mind from a scientific perspective at BigelowInstitute.org. But the second place winner in that essay contest of 29 essays was by Pim van Lommel, a Dutch cardiologist. And he did a brilliant job in his essay. But at the end of his essay, he's making the case for the one mind. And he points out from his perspective that there are 4 resources that make that case scientifically better than any others. One of those is The One Mind by Larry Dossey. Second one is our book, Living in a Mindful Universe. The third is a paper by Bernardo Castro. I think it's in the Journal of Consciousness Studies in 2018, and it's called the Universe in Mind, or something like that. Incredibly good. Bernardo Castro with a K is another great resource. But then the fourth book that Pim van Lommel mentions at the end of his essay is Spiritual Science by Steve Taylor. And I agree completely. When I read this, it was a very well thought out, very good for kind of the layperson. It's not, all the deepest scientific stuff. It includes that, enough of that to make the case, but it's very readable by the average layperson. So Spiritual Science by Steve Taylor, I highly recommend for anyone wanting to get way up to speed on all the science that supports this, but also a rich respect for the kind of spiritual universe and spiritual beings that all of this science is pointing to is the way reality works. And Steve Taylor does that extremely well in his book, Spiritual Science.
Yeah. So we want to turn now to your own experiences. For anybody having an NDE, when you wake up, it must just be mind-blowing. I can only imagine that for a neurosurgeon to have had the experience, it must be like, oh my God, I've been given the greatest gift of all time because I understand now so much more. Is that what it was like for you?
Well, it's a little more complex than that, because a huge part of my journey, one thing to know, Near-death experiences are always tailored for the individual soul who has them, period. There's no other reason for their existence. However, if we study near-death experiences in large numbers by the hundreds and thousands, we realize there's a lot of commonality. So a lot of things that teach us about the nature of this universe by paying attention to these experiences and what they tell us. But in my particular case, just like for everybody else, it was for me. And that meant it had to be strong enough that I would pay attention, and it had to have the right features. And some of those were atypical features. For example, my NDE was absolutely in a realm of amnesia. I had no knowledge of Earth, this universe, no memories of Eben Alexander's life, no language. Every bit of it was gone. It was an empty slate. But that extremely deep dive, and I've never heard of that amnesia being that strong in anyone else's NDE. So don't worry about that happening to you. But in my case, it had to happen for me to kind of come to the deeper understandings of it all. And I think that's a very important point to make. So that I spent this week in coma back in November 2008 with my brain soaking in pus. And this wasn't a little case of meningitis. This was an absolutely deadly, should have killed me meningitis. And that is all supported not just by the facts I put in the book Proof of Heaven, the medical facts, but also in a medical case report on my medical records. It was written by 3 doctors, not involved in my care, but absolutely fascinated by my recovery. And they took over 2 years to review my medical records and then write this report up in a fashion that they could submit it to a medical journal. And they sent it to the Journal of Nervous and Mental Disease, a very respected medical journal. And it was peer reviewed and accepted, but they challenged the authors. They said, well, how do you explain this? You know, we don't know of other cases of people this sick from bacterial meningoencephalitis, with Glasgow coma scales down at 5, 6, 7, anything below 9 being deep coma. My CSF glucose, and you or me, that glucose level, a sugar level would be 80 or 90. In somebody with bad bacterial meningitis, it might drop down to 20. In my case, the glucose level was 1. Nobody in the consulting pool up and down the eastern seaboard for my medical illness had ever heard of somebody with a CSF glucose of 1. And that means the bacteria had long ago gotten tired of eating the glucose in my fluid, but were eating my brain. And the MRI scans, CT scans shows full thickness damage to the neocortex. My brainstem was damaged. All the neurologic exams made it very clear I was in deep trouble, absent oculocardiac reflex and low GCS scores. It was I was in terrible shape, and yet I came back from it all. And when I woke up in the ICU room and was fighting the ventilator, and they pulled out the breathing tube, my amnesia was still very much in power. I didn't recognize my mother, my sisters, my sons at the bedside. I had no idea who these beings were. All I knew was this extraordinary spiritual journey I had just been on. And not only that, but after the breathing tube was out and I was, coming back to this world and finally beginning to recover some memories of language and of these beings around me as being related to me, I also went in and out of a 36-hour paranoid delusional psychotic nightmare, an ICU psychosis. But the interesting thing is the rich, beautiful spiritual memories from deep in coma, when all the medical facts showed that my brain was inactive. There was no way that brain could give you a dream or hallucination. It was far too damaged. And yet that's when I had this profound experience. All that, the various, what are called veridical time anchors, the faces I saw at the end, all of this proving to me that the vast majority of the coma journey happened when my brain was at its worst. That's where the big lesson is. And those memories are as sharp today as if the whole thing happened yesterday. Whereas the memories of that psychotic nightmare disappeared within 2 or 3 weeks. And I'm glad I was busy writing everything down, because that's how I had the memories of it. And yet the memories of the deep spiritual coma experience, which shouldn't have happened by modern tenets of neuroscience, and yet they did. And I ended up coming back. That was one of the biggest points, was in explaining to the peer review editors why this case could be explained. They said it's because he had a near-death experience. They knew of other people who'd had profound approaches to death, should have died, And yet they came back to this world and their cancer was healed, like in Anita Morjani's case, or their Mary C. Neal, who had an over 30-minute warm water drowning while kayaking in Chile. She ended up brought to the surface dead, but made a full recovery. Now, for me, when I first came back to this world, I explained that amnesia by saying, well, I guess all that damage to my brain that my doctors tell me was there, that must have gotten rid of all those memories. But my memories were coming back. In fact, by 2 months post-coma, memories were more clear, complete, and detailed than they had been before the coma. We talk about that in the third book, in Living in a Mindful Universe, about a lot of these kind of features of my illness and recovery that are not covered in the book Proof of Heaven. But it really, to me, was an absolutely astonishing set of events. And of course, anybody who's read the book Proof of Heaven will realize that one of the most powerful events of it all was encountering a spiritual guide. Now, if I had scripted all this, that spiritual guide would have been my adoptive father. He had passed over 4 years before my coma. My adoptive father was a globally renowned neurosurgeon, and yet he was nowhere to be found in my near-death experience. And he actually told me why. His spirit did 2.5 years later during a meditation. We cover all that in the book Living in a Mindful Universe. But the way he explained it was, if he had appeared to me as the spirit guide during my NDE, in spite of the fact I had a 1 in 10 million diagnosis, E. coli meningitis in an adult, in spite of a 1 in a billion recovery, if he had been there, the materialist neuroscientist in me, in spite of the ultra reality of the experience, would have tried to explain it away. Oh yeah, you see who you want to see on the way out. That's why it had to be somebody completely removed from that. Has to do with my birth family history and a birth sister who I never knew in this life. In fact, she passed from this world 10 years before my coma. All that is told in Proof of Heaven and Living in a Mindful Universe. But the reality is, it forced me to accept the whole spiritual experience in the NDE seemed way too real to be real, because it really happened. Didn't happen in the physical world, but most of the big stuff of this universe doesn't happen in the physical world. It happens in a world of ideals. That's that world that we encounter in life reviews, that happen in about half of all near-death experiences. And life reviews, in a third of the cases, are more real and detailed than living it in life. And you might wonder, how does that happen? It's because in that realm, our mind is in the eternity, and not in this kind of earthbound time flow realm that we're used to in our material body. Anyway, the whole thing has been an incredibly rich learning experience for me, and that's why I've continued to, put out the books that talk about it, Proof of Heaven, The Map of Heaven, and then the most recent one is Living in a Mindful Universe, which in many ways is Ed Kelly's book, Consciousness Unbound, but for the more general reader, because his book is incredibly deep and challenging, even for a scientific mind. And our book, Living in a Mindful Universe, is a little easier for those with, who don't have a PhD in cosmology or quantum physics or something like that. So Living in a Mindful Universe is really that kind of consciousness unbound for the rest of us.
Many NDE experiences say that integration can take a lifetime. Has there been difficulty for you, any challenges in reconciling what you knew in that realm with the limits of language and scientific framework here?
Well, I would say, yes, it's been quite a seesaw, an up, down, but it's always been progressed. That is, it's always shown promise, improvement, and increased knowledge as I've gone along the pathway. But it's not like it's been a steady journey upwards of kind of beautiful reconciliation and understanding of all reality. There have been ups and downs. And from my perspective, I would say that having serious, true, open-minded skepticism is one of the most important ingredients. There's a saying I'll paraphrase from Rene Descartes. The quote is in our book, Proof of Heaven. But somewhere in that book, we quote Descartes, and he said that if you would claim to be a true seeker in this world, at some point in your life, you must reject everything you've ever come to believe is truth. In other words, doubt all your assumptions. And I found after my NDE, I had to do that. I had to go back to square one and say, none of this is real. I've got to start from, building this up out of everything I know about reality. And that certainly involved a tremendous amount of kind of acknowledging the reality of my near-death experience, and the fact that it brought this inexplicable healing to me. I mean, that is a tremendous gift. And you can bet I've turned that gratitude into serious effort to understand what the lessons are. But there have been doubts at certain points, as I, especially in the first few months of putting it all together, when I was writing down everything. And then I started diving deep into the NDE literature. I'd never read that before. I always thought, near-death experiences are hallucinations, tricks of the dying brain. Now I had my own experience. I realized that is completely wrong, and I had to come to a much richer understanding. But point out, very importantly here, that there are many people, including scientists, who claim to be skeptical, but they're not. They're pseudo-skeptics. They've already made up their mind. They think, the only stuff that exists is the physical world. These must be dreams and hallucinations. They can't have anything to do with reality because they're inexplicable by our very weak materialist theoretical models. But as we said earlier, now that the Nobel Prize in Physics in 2022 was given for entanglement, I think people are recognizing that the modern scientific world is wide open to bigger considerations, because the main thing that entanglement ends is, for one thing, this notion that four-dimensional space-time is the ultimate arbiter of reality and causal relationships. There are deeper connections, and that's what I would call the entanglement field. And that's a field of potentiality, a field, a good friend of mine, Edgar Mitchell, the Apollo 14 lunar module pilot, I got to stay with him, got to know him well in Florida during several visits back in 2014, but he would call it the quantum hologram. That's what he called it in one particular. But anyway, that's the information field we're talking about, that holds all possibilities for thought and for actualities to emerge in this universe. And I would say that's the entanglement field. They really have very similar characteristics. But what we throw out as no longer adequate is that four-dimensional space-time is the limit of information kind of transfer and interaction and causal relationships in the universe. And also, in the same vein, we're getting rid of what's called local realism. That's what Einstein rebelled so much about with entanglement, what he called spooky action at a distance. Mm-hmm. And he complained about it in a 1935 paper with Podolsky and Rosen, the EPR paper. And he said basically that quantum physics was incomplete, that there were hidden variables, and that they would explain how these particles knew how to behave to explain entanglement, but in a way that made more sense to his logical, rational mind. Well, that's when John Bell in 1964, brilliant Irish physicist, came up with, oh boy, you can actually do some experiments to test whether it's hidden variables or entanglement, spooky action at a distance. And it was statistical correlations in quantum experiments. John Clauser, who was the first of three winners of the Nobel Prize, Clauser did the experiment, and both he and Bell expected Einstein to be right. Experiments done, Einstein was wrong. And in fact, entanglement was real. And that's when Alain Aspect, and he was a French optical physicist who came up with very fast switching mechanisms. So even as photons are flying at the speed of light through this apparatus, you can try and fool them by switching the gates with these very fast optical switches Alain Aspect developed. And his experiment showed the same thing. Entanglement is real. It's not hidden variables. Get over it. And then finally, it was Anton Zeilinger, the third winner of that prize from Austria, who made the experiment truly giant in ways to bypass these what are called loopholes from physicists trying to explain how we could preserve local realism somehow. And no, it doesn't work with these experiments using stars hundreds of light years apart to set the parameters of the experiment. Still, entanglement's absolutely real. So Einstein was wrong. And finally, in 2022, the Nobel Prize Committee admitted all that and gave the award out for entanglement. Local realism, and that statement, the local part is that all physics is particles touching each other locally. So I look at a star, the photon from that star touches my eye. That's the local interaction that allows physics to all be local. The word realism means that there's an objective physical reality before you do the measurement. And yet what we know, especially with entangled multiple pairs of quantum particles, you can show how none of them actually have the property before the measurement occurs. So as Pascual Jordan, a famous quantum physicist, said, our observations not only reveal underlying reality, they create it. And this is where mind over matter, evolutionary panentheism is pointing to quantum indeterminacy as allowing for free will in sentient beings. And all of it starts to make much more sense in this bigger vision that leaves the simplistic, bleak, and paltry fiction of materialism in the rearview mirror. And that fiction is that the physical world is all that exists. And therefore, when the brain and body die, your awareness ceases to exist. That is a fiction. That is not true. That is a lie from the materialist scientists who have not had the energy or intelligence or what have you to study the BigelowInstitute.org essays to realize how wrong materialism is.
So you must have asked many, many questions in the 18 years since then. And I would imagine one of the biggest ones is, why me?
Well, I would simply say, as we said earlier, near-death experiences are always there for the individual sentient being who has them. In other words, to reveal to that being a little bit more about the workings of this universe and their relationship to it. Mine is nothing special other than the fact that I'm a neurosurgeon and I had this disease that absolutely should have killed me and did not, and allowed me to have this profound experience. Now, when I came out of it all, my doctors initially were trying to tell me I'd share this spiritual journey I had. And they said, well, you can forget about it. They'd pat me on the back, say, your brain was soaking in pus. We have no idea how you're even coming back to us, but the dying brain can play all kinds of tricks. Well, that was good enough until I started doing my own homework, going through my medical records, went back and talked it over with my neurologists. There were two of them who took care of me. And others, and came to realize, no, this brain could not have mustered any kind of dream or hallucination because there was too much damage to it. And then to explain this full recovery, that doesn't fit into our medical models at all. And so I would say that the recovery, as the three authors of that medical case report made very clear, was linked to the fact I had this deep spiritual journey. That's what allowed for this fantastic inexplicable recovery. So in other words, it's from a scientific perspective, just suggesting we broaden our understanding. And I would simply say, given the world's interest in kind of the nature of reality, yes, my NDE does contribute a tremendous amount. The ingredients were just right. And that's why, some of the attacks against me are just ad hominem attacks. They're trying to take down my reputation and credibility because they have absolutely no counter whatsoever to the details of my story and to my recovery. They have no explanation. So they have to pretend none of it is real. And so they try to accuse me of fabrication, et cetera. But it just shows you how much that my journey has contributed to the scientific literature on this. Because the scientific world, I remember we went to a conference in Belgium in 2018, and somebody from Belgium a neuroscientist put up the slide where they showed that the number of scientific papers worldwide covering near-death experiences, that number quadrupled in the year 2012 and 2013 compared to the 32 prior years. And that's when Proof of Heaven was published. And the case they were making was that Proof of Heaven was like a catalyst. That book totally opened the scientific world to say, now let's study this. This is real stuff. And then that's continued since then, this interest and these books that we've talked about, Ed Kelly's work, et cetera. I mean, we're making tremendous progress, leaps and bounds. Institute.org essays make it crystal clear. Any scientist out there who says materialism is right, this is all woo-woo nonsense because our science proves it, when you read the 29 essays, you'll realize, no, you got it completely wrong. Go read the essays and you'll realize just how wrong you are. Materialism is dead. Now, don't ask Wikipedia. Wikipedia is right front and center trying to damage and destroy reputations and make sure that materialism reigns supreme. And Wikipedia is a pseudo encyclopedia. They're claiming, that something like remote viewing or near-death experiences are pseudoscience, but that's because they're not scientific. They have no clue what they're talking about. And there's Gestapo editors at Wikipedia that, try and suppress anything that has to do with the spiritual realities that the scientific world is coming to realize are absolutely real aspects of our universe.
Yeah. So When you look at your journey from neurosurgeon to near-death experiencer to consciousness researcher, what has it taught you about humility in the face of the unknown?
Well, I think I realized early on after my coma that one of the greatest indicators of true wisdom is a widespread admission of the limitations of your knowledge. Don't begin to tell me that we're close to a theory of everything. I promise you, humans will always be on a journey of discovery. And we're just now, in fact, reaching a culmination of discovery that I would say has been about 5,000 years in the making. And interestingly enough, a lot of the deepest truths that we're coming to from a scientific perspective in the modern era mirror beautifully statements from, theologians and spiritual leaders 2,000 years ago in both the East and the West. Notions of oneness, the binding force of love, and how it serves to bring healing and wholeness to us as sentient beings. I mean, all of these deep and profound truths, the power of meditation and centering prayer for connecting with our true higher soul and ability to willfully influence our emerging reality. These are all profound truths that are emerging from this current study of consciousness, the mind-brain relationship, quantum physics, and the nature of reality. So it's an exciting time to be alive, but let's not get too cocky about all this and realize that there have been very brilliant minds far into the past that really see where this is headed. They glimpsed it through their deepest meditations, through their visions, through hardship and challenges and what have you. But all of this adds up to a much richer, more complete version of who we are and how we should be living these lives. But it's especially important in the current materialistic mind setting because materialism gives this false sense of separation. And that's why we can have warfare. That's why we can have violence and people committing violent acts against others. We can have corporate greed where scientists might knowingly dismiss all the scientific evidence for climate change because the energy industry makes so much money after selling coal and oil. But these are all things that are threatening thousands of species around the world. Climate change, human caused, is absolutely beyond any reasonable scientific doubt. We've got to change our behavior, and that involves a much more heartfelt love for our fellow beings and for the planet at large. So ultimately, the deepest lessons of what I'm talking about in terms of consciousness, primacy of mind, how we're all in this together through these binding forces of love, needs to cause an adjustment in how we live these lives and how we manage our stewardship of this beautiful planet. Because we're in the process of wrecking it through this simplistic false sense of separation inherent in materialism. We've already agreed materialism died in the scientific world. It's no longer applicable. So the rest of us should realize that materialism is false, that this one mind, this binding force of love that is so obvious to near-death experiencers is a huge part of understanding our responsibility to our fellow beings to get it right and to start living a much more mature, soul-filled, spiritual approach to life, which admits to our connection and to our wholeness and healing that's possible when we come to recognize this notion of oneness of mind, shared meaning, and shared purpose.
Yeah, absolutely. Well said. I have two questions before we close. The first one is, what's next for you?
Well, I've, as Karen, my wife and partner and co-author of Living in a Mindful Universe will tell you, I'm always talking about mechanism. I want to know much more about this top-down causality and how the quantum field has influence, in the mental and the brain, in all of emergent physical reality, and how we can better take these lessons of love and wholeness and healing and bring them to fruition with the lives of all of our fellow beings. So for me, fine-tuning that notion of mechanism and especially demonstrating our how grand our abilities of free will and of manifesting the world of our dreams can be with this new understanding. So ironing out that mechanism and helping people understand the nature of it and to put it to use in their lives. This certainly involves meditation, centering prayer. I meditate an hour or two a day. I use sacred acoustics Karen Newell, my co-author of Living in a Mindful Universe, is the co-founder of sacredacoustics.com. It's a form of binaural beat brainwave entrainment, very powerful technique for going deep within. I use Sacred Acoustics every day. I've been doing that an hour to a day for the last 12, 13 years, and it's brought me tremendous benefits in health and understanding. I would highly recommend, if any of your listeners don't have an active program of meditation, if you need something to start out, Sacred Acoustics uses audio and headphones to split the sound signal to the two ears. It's a very powerful way to get into deep states of transcendental conscious awareness. You can go to sacredacoustics.com to learn a lot more.
So, final question. Steve Jobs famously gave all the attendees at his memorial service a copy of Autobiography of a Yogi.
Sorry, copy of what?
Autobiography of a Yogi.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah, Yogananda's book.
Yes,
so what book would you want given to the attendees at your memorial service?
Well, that is a very good question. After all we've said about these books and favorites, I don't even know if that book has been written yet. Because it would be one that absolutely answered took where we are now with our understanding, like Consciousness Unbound, Spiritual Science, Living in a Mindful Universe, and took them to the next level. So I think that book still needs to be written. That's the one I've had in mind now for several years.
There you go.
You've inspired me. I think I need to get working on it, but it would be some combination of these books that we've mentioned here, especially these recent ones, the ones that Pim Van Lommel pointed out to Showing the One Mind. But I think I need to work on that. So I'll get back to you as soon as I can make any real progress.
Well, hopefully you've got, many, many, many years to work on it.
Well, I hope so. And for me, every day is exciting, a day of gratitude, a day of amazement, that these beautiful gifts of understanding come our way. And so I'm certainly willing to live that and try and share it as best I can.
Dr. Eben Alexander, thank you for sharing your 10 best spiritual books and the extraordinary journey behind, your life, accomplishments, etc., and experiences with the No BS Spiritual Book Club's library of recommendations.
Well, thank you, Sandie, for having me on, and thanks for all you do with these 10 best books, because I've been looking through your lists, and wow, it's great insight into people's thinking, and some of my favorite thought leaders are out there, and I love seeing the books that inspire them.
Yeah. So what strikes me most about Dr. Eben Alexander's story is how it bridges two worlds that once seemed irreconcilable: science and spirit, logic and mystery. And it reminds us that discovery doesn't stop where science ends. It expands when both begin to meet. It also makes me wonder if the real frontier of discovery isn't outer space or inner space, but that meeting point where both finally recognize they've been describing the same reality all along. So I hope that you do write the book, because we need that book now.
Well, I've been inspired, so we'll get to work.
Good. Okay, you get to work. So for more information about Dr. Eben Alexander's books, courses, events, and research, visit his website at ebenalexander.com. And don't forget sacredacoustics.com as well. That's it for this week. I'm Sandie Sedgbeer. I'll be back at the same time next week with another 10 best interview for the No BS Spiritual Book Club. Till then, it's goodbye from me, and thank you again to Dr. Eben Alexander.
If today's conversation sparked your curiosity, you'll love our other shows. The Synergy Sessions, where leading-edge thinkers collide in bold, unscripted dialogues that ignite new possibilities. Between Realms and Reason, where we journey into the mysterious consciousness, energy, and the hidden layers of reality, where science converges with spirit in ways you've never imagined. And the No BS Spiritual Book Club, where leading-edge new thought speakers, teachers, authors, and luminaries who've walked this path before you share the 10 books that had the biggest impact on their life journey. All 3 shows are available on YouTube, Spotify, Substack, and all major podcast platforms.
For more information, visit sedgbeer.com. That's SEDGBEER.com.